over time, Schoolbox has done a lot of work, and even talking about, following on from James, a lot of work on how we restrict our access to information, how we better use permissions in the system to help you secure your data, to help those user experiences be a little bit more controlled. In the past, everyone had to be a super user. In the past, authentication was a different journey. As Schoolbox has evolved and matured in that space, sometimes as a school, it's difficult to reflect, to understand what's changed, to look at how you can do your practice a little bit differently. So this conversation and this workshop today is going to get you to have a look at your environment and your experience and see what could you do differently. Now, I've got one question before we get started, just to help my brain out a little bit. Who here does not have access to their staging server? Cool. And who here is not a super user? All right, we've got one person. Awesome. That's cool. We'll solve your problem shortly. So this session is, I probably should introduce myself. That also helps. So I'm Dwayne. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Schoolbox. I've been with the business now for about 8 years. Across that time, I've worked with nearly every team in the business. I've worked with most of our schools in either implementing or supporting different components of their journey. I'm joined here by Evan, who's going to pick up a microphone because he gets to introduce himself.
I'm Evan. I'm the infrastructure manager, so we've got some technical parts of today's session, and I'll go through those and leave the product bits to Dwayne to talk about.
Awesome. So as you can see, we're looking at a few different topics here. So looking at authentication and uplifting and working through the authentication approach in your systems. What are the options and what are the things that you might be able to do a little bit differently? Thinking about the service permissions and removing and moving away from that context of everyone being a super user, and are there other ways of designing the system and the architecture to better support your school? I'm going to get you to actually review your environment, walk away from here with a plan of attack for Monday to go and make the changes that are needed. I had a conversation with someone last night where they were like, these two people have to be doing this, and then I was like, no, they don't. The permissions have existed for a long period of time, so this is about thinking critically about what you can do differently. We'll talk a little bit for those using pastoral care, looking at the pastoral care visibility settings and some tweaks that you might be able to make there, and then talk about some of the changes to the student profile. There's a lot more control now and a lot more ability to restrict down a lot of components to that profile to really, really focus on, do these people need to see that information and that data? But kicking it off to start off is around our user authentication inside Schoolbox. I'll hand over to you, Evan.
Thank you, Dwayne. To start with, who did my Hoover poll in the app about what authentication method your instance is using? Who saw the poll? A few people. There must have been a lot of people who did the poll who aren't here because there was almost 50 responses. Anyway, thank you for everyone who did that. That was really interesting information to see before this session. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that you can manage user authentication in Schoolbox. And there's 4 methods that are available. And we're going to talk about which ones are sort of the good, better, and best type thing. So firstly, a bit of background of why you might want to modernize your user authentication in Schoolbox. So Schoolbox supports a wide range of modern authentication protocols, SAML and OAuth being the 2 widely used ones. Each protocol has its advantage and disadvantage, particularly in the case of LDAP and local accounts. And most schools currently use a mixture of authentication methods to tie in with your wider tech stack. However, of course, as security best practices evolve, it's important that you continue to evolve the configuration of your Schoolbox's authentication to keep up. So just to go over some of those methods. So the most basic one is local accounts. The users live in Schoolbox only. This is great where you don't have an identity system or you don't have a SIS to authenticate back against. But in the case of most schools you do, and hence you probably want to avoid local accounts. The most common case we see them being used still is for parent accounts. But this is something you really should reconsider as well. Then we have our legacy authentication solutions we support. So LDAP, which has been a local network authentication protocol that has existed for a long time, is something we do still support. However, with the movement towards cloud, it's something that we need our customers to move away from. And you'll want to move away from that as well. So you can start taking advantage of modern identity providers that support things like conditional access, multi-factor authentication, and other much better security mechanisms. Another more legacy method we see happening a lot is SAML, which is a modern protocol, but authenticating against a on-premise Active Directory Federation service server. So that means whilst you're using SAML, which is a cloud-suitable authentication method, you're still authenticating against a self-hosted on-premise server. And that's, again, something that you'd be wanting to look at moving away from to take advantage of cloud solutions like Entra ID, Google Workspace, PIPS, CloudWork, Okta, or other solutions like that. And then finally, there's our best approach, or what schools who are implementing Schoolbox typically implement today, and that's either SAML or OAuth via a cloud identity provider solution. And this is what we call the authentication golden pathway. These both solutions are both fully cloud compatible, and being cloud first, they help reduce your IT overhead and tech debt. So I'm going to use a couple of examples here of what some of our schools have configured who have gone down this authentication golden pathway. So our recommendation is that for all users, you authenticate against a cloud-based identity provider. So that's parents, staff, and students. And that removes the need to manage an overhead legacy LDAP or ADFS solution, as well as making sure your Schoolbox instance is ready to move to cloud from an authentication perspective. Common solutions we see, most common is Microsoft Entra ID, which is formerly known as Azure Active Directory. Google Workspace is also used a fair bit, and we see a little bit of use of more dedicated authentication solutions such as Okta. The advantage of using these modern solutions is it's very easy for you to implement MFA for some or all of your user groups at the identity provider level, and that allows you to align your security into Schoolbox with your school's general IT security policy and your risk tolerance. The best way we find to integrate these solutions is via SAML, but you can integrate them via OAuth as well. And I've just put up an example there of one of our schools, Dulwich College in Singapore, who have implemented Entra ID using OAuth, SAML, for their staff and students login. The next piece of the puzzle is parents, and this is the one that schools typically find trickier because not all schools have their parents in their cloud identity solution. Some do choose to give them accounts in Entra ID, but others find that it's a little bit cost or complexity prohibitive. So there's a couple of good solutions on the market for this. The first one is using a dedicated education-focused identity management platform, such as PIPS, so Parent Identity Passport, or CloudWorks solution. Often schools configure those for parents to use OAuth. Or as an alternate, if you're using a SIS that can act as an identity provider, such as ISAMS, you can also authenticate directly against that for parents. Both of these are cloud-first and modern solutions, and by using these dedicated tools, it does help you to keep your licensing costs in your primary identity platforms, such as Entra, Okta, or Google Workspace, under control. It does create a good user experience for parents. Tools like PIPS and CloudWork allow you to have much nicer authentication methods for parents that don't necessarily need them to authenticate using a school-specific account. And these integrate really well into Schoolbox using OAuth. All right. And again, just there, you can see how Dulwich College has set up a parent login button using their ISAMS OAuth. So within Schoolbox, you can have both SAML and OAuth running at once, and Dulwich have actually used some custom CSS to remove the local account login fields. All right, so this is just a bit of a diagram of how the identity methods work for each user role. The users don't really know what's going on in the background. They simply go to Schoolbox and choose their relevant button, and then Schoolbox directs them to the right identity provider, depending on whether they've clicked the button that's hooked up to SAML or hooked up to OAuth. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is something that we have had available for a while from Schoolbox 24.0, but hasn't been taken up a lot by schools, and that's how you can actually flip the paradigm around and use Schoolbox as an identity system. The purpose of this originally was to allow schools to access Paperly, so our premier partner, without having to do another login. However, what it also allows you to do is integrate with any OAuth app that you have. Effectively, what this means is you can use Schoolbox as a front-end login and a broker to authenticate your staff, students, and parents against your primary identity platform. Once they've logged into Schoolbox, you can then use Schoolbox to on-authenticate them to other platforms that use OAuth. So this could be Paperly or any other application, whether that be an off-the-shelf one or something you've coded yourself at school that's specific to you, such as your intranet maybe, that uses OAuth. So this diagram here shows an example using Digistorm. This is actually the legacy way that Digistorm had to authenticate. So the user would go to Digistorm, Digistorm would then authenticate the user and then pass that through the Schoolbox. And on this slide here, it shows how you can use Schoolbox as the authentication method and Digistorm. Schoolbox is the authentication method, and that passes back into Digistorm, being our example app. So effectively what this allows you to do is, previously a lot of schools would find that their apps they use could only support one integrated authentication method, but by using Schoolbox as the front for this and to broker the authentication, you can take advantage of Schoolbox's flexibility to allow staff, students, and parents to use different authentication methods and then pass that through as a singular OAuth authentication into the third-party app that has less flexibility. Just before I pass back to Dwayne, does anyone have any questions about authentication? Yes. I don't see why not. So what would happen in... actually, no, I take that back, no. When you use the QR code, what that is doing is using effectively a really long password that's baked onto the URL, and that passes the user in. That will not work for, say, authenticating into Mathletics, because when you go to the Mathletics website, it would pass the user back to Schoolbox. If they'd already logged into Schoolbox with that code on the device, yes, it would work because they would see there's already an active Schoolbox session and it would just pass through. If they hadn't already logged into Schoolbox, they're going to get hit with the normal login prompt. So, yeah.
And just to add on to that, I believe Mathletics does support LTI 1.1 or 1.0, and that actually is then able to do the authentication from the class into Mathletics. So, yeah. All right, sounds like you two need to talk.
Thank you for the question, though. Any other questions? No. Awesome. We'll have more time for Q&A at the end. Otherwise, back over to you, Dwayne.
Awesome, thank you. So, thank you very much. One of the things that we've found over time is, obviously, as we release features, it's sometimes hard to miss some of the little details or some of the changes that come about. So in 24.1, so we're a while ago now, we actually looked at our service permission structures and we redesigned our administration area. We redesigned the system to better segregate out aspects of responsibility. So the first question I've got for you, if you open up your laptop, sign into your staging server or your production if you want, go have a look and answer that question. Do you have too many super users? Because my answer for most of you will definitely be yes. The worst one so far I've seen is 19 super users. That is 19 people that have active control of everything inside your system. It's a very, very risky and scary place. Hey, Scotty, have you got your laptop on you? No. All right. There was a young lady at the middle. Thank you. All right, so when we look at the idea and the concept of a super user, this idea is they effectively have access to everything. Everything apart from pastoral care records, but the caveat behind that is they can give themselves the permission to have pastoral access. So when we think about that, they can manage these service permissions. They can manage the core aspects of the system, such as your security settings, your authentication, your external database, your user management. They can go and impersonate any user across the system. They have access to all of the logs. A question for some of you: how much do you trust every single person in that list of super users to be able to act responsibly and solve all of those problems or have access to all of that? How many of you do trust everyone in that list? One person. So this was one of the conversations we had leading into 24.1 was going, all right, how do we segregate and break down what's taking place? One of the old excuses of why everyone needs to be a super user is they need to be able to impersonate everyone. Or they need to be able to go and access all of the folders. Or no, they need to see every news item. So one of the things about Schoolbox is we've actually had most of these for a long period of time. And these service permissions are designed to restrict down the access. But one of the things we did in 24.1 was completely redesign how the administration area and the administration of Schoolbox worked off the back of these service permissions. So with these service permissions, there's 3 key concepts, but I really wanted to just run through these pretty quickly and give you a sense of the key changes and the key pieces that are helpful. So the first is that impersonator feature is really, really important now. So you have your principal that wants to be able to impersonate everyone, or maybe wants to be able to impersonate the parents. You can go and provide that service permission, go, cool, you're able to impersonate all parents in the system. So when you jump in and have a look, and I'll get you guys in a moment to jump in and start playing around with this, change some users, impersonate them, see what it looks like, hence why the staging server. But what you start to see is you start to give them the skill, or you start to give them the responsibility of looking at just that little small piece. One of the ones that often comes up is I need to give them super user because I want them to be able to control and build folders and classes, and they're responsible for all of that. The CMS permission inside Schoolbox is actually older than I am at Schoolbox. And it gives you access to that entire resource tree. That can be read, so you can see everything, or that can be write, where you can control everything. As we start to look at some of these other ones now, and the way in which we've designed the changes is the LMS service permission actually gives you access to the learning area of our administration platform. So this means that they can make all of the learning policy decisions, set up the course and unit templates, set up the lesson plan templates. So we've started to break down the administration of the system to align to these as well. The pastoral moderator and the pastoral permissions are a little bit different than the rest of them. In regards to the pastoral moderator permission is the only person in the system, or the only people in the system, that can see all pastoral care records and that are able to delete pastoral care records. When we look at service permissions, there's really 3 permission structures or layers to it. Not all of them have everything. This actually confused a lot of staff for a while as well, is, well, why does this one have read, not write? And at one point, we actually, for all service permissions, provided all of the options, even though for a lot of them, they didn't do anything. So to read means you're able to view the records of the information. You can see what's going on. This applies to things like news, calendar, the CMS, the pastoral. You're giving people access to components of it. Write gives them the ability to modify and update all of these components. And moderate, which typically apply to things like news and pastoral, provide additional ability to oversee and change what others are doing. And as I said before, what we did in 24.1 was change the administration area of Schoolbox to be dynamic. So it used to be to access admin, you had to be a super user. So you were responsible for every single configuration. You wanted to change, a single grading scale. It had to be a super user that did that. Now, by adding these permissions in, you start to isolate and change a way that the pastoral moderator, all of the pastoral settings are found inside the administration area, and they only see those settings. If you are the designer or the news and communication, like the one on the right-hand side, you get access to the design. So you can change the skin config, the homepage templates, the look and feel of the platform, or you can control the news. And this was the exciting one for everyone. The impersonate permission. I don't know how many conversations I had with people about this leading up to us eventually releasing it. But this allows you to go, you can go and impersonate any staff member or any student or any parent. The really cool thing with service permissions is you can have multiple service permissions. You don't just have to have one. So you might have your marketing and media team or your communication team. They're a designer, they do news, and they do calendar. Give them all of them. It doesn't matter, but what you're doing now is restricting down the access, that not everyone has to have access to everything. The really cool thing with the impersonate is there's now also an impersonate log in the admin UI. So we used to actually have this stored behind the scenes, but now we've surfaced it because that permission came about. Meaning you can go and see who impersonated the others inside the system. So, as I said before, I want everyone in here to have a look at that list of super users and go, okay, I can go back and go, these 3 people no longer need to be super users. And on your staging instance, I actually want you to go and change their role or removing that super user flag, and then go and change and add the service permission you think they need, impersonate them, and see what their experience looks like. I'll be floating around, as will Evan, as will Claire, to help you understand those variations and those changes. Yes?
Something that we do is we have one account, several users, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Because when we send out messages, say, I don't want my name to be attached to, say, a newsletter, and
Yep.
so we send it out using the DCB communications account.
Yep.
However, when the DCB communications account impersonates, I don't know, maybe it's changed, but and tell me if it's
Yep.
changed. We don't know which person is impersonating, if
Yep.
that makes sense. So is there any way now? Has there been any changes to that?
Yep.
That's my question.
So if you're using impersonate, which is this thing here, that's what this log here is showing you. Is the person on the left-hand side impersonated the other. I wish I could zoom in, sorry. If you're using linked accounts, it's a little bit different. So for an impersonate, the log will tell you, I am the Schoolbox admin, and I'm now impersonating the trial user. And this log exists in the administration area. That's been there for a while now, and that will tell you who it is that's impersonated the other people. If it's a linked account, no, we don't have logs, because we effectively, we infer from a linked account that these people are interchangeable. And so that's where there's the difference.
So for instance, with like the admin group, could you have the admin team just impersonating one account?
No, so we haven't focused it down on an individual account. So one of the questions when we talk about admin teams, what is it that they want to see?
Well, they've got their own personal accounts, but then if they're posting something, you may want them to post it as admin rather than as themselves.
Yeah. So there's 2 things, and this is sort of that same concept of having that linked account. So which is that ability to go and I'm going to switch to being the school's persona versus your own. There's actually a really interesting question about doing that versus not. So often unpacking and talking to schools about why they do it. From a communication standpoint, having someone's name and face attached to communication actually typically makes people engage with it better. They form the connection straight away. So for a lot of schools, there's a question about what is the purpose and the reason to do that is one of the first components. So should you be doing that is the first piece. If you are, then a linked account is the approach you take behind it. In regards to do we track that who switched over to that context? No, because we trust them, but that's a process in regards to which one of the people actually did that. So it's a little bit different scenario. Oh, cool. Another question? Evan, you can wander around the room and see if people want to break their Schoolbox instances. Claire, you as well.
Yep. Love the work in terms of the service permission. It's beautiful. But one of the things that we try to implement is just-in-time privileged access. Just wondering whether or not that's actually on the roadmap in Schoolbox.
So when you talk about just-in-time privilege access, what data in particular?
We are looking at the moment, particularly on super users. So we don't actually want. So what we have at the moment is that we have a separate account for super admin. So for those who actually have a super account, we actually have a separate account that's separated away from our daily account. So that prevents from, phasing or anything like that. So one of the things we will try to simplify is to have a just-in-time escalation, so that anyone who wants to impersonate or try to do something under a super user, that needs to go through approval process.
So one of the things that we've tried to do when we look at permission structures, especially in administration, there are very few components of the Schoolbox admin area that have criticality tied into them in regards to where privileged access becomes really, really important. The key areas where it does become, a key thing is actually adding the pastoral service permission is one example where the criticality of that becomes a little bit more important. It's actually why we talk about that super user list really, really reducing down to the couple or 2 or 3 people, so that you're reducing that risk profile. In most other settings, e.g. things like external database, authentication and others, we've started to dramatically change the impact of that.
Yeah, so one of our use cases, particularly around pastoral care, is that sometimes staff might need temporary access to a particular record. And this is where I think implementation of just-in-time works well, because we can go, you can have 1 hour access, do an investigation, and then we can revoke it.
Yeah. So pastoral care is probably one place where there is a little bit of a difference as to what we're thinking around access. And one of the things I'll talk to a little bit later is around the concept of the campus mappings and actually reducing down the access based on you can't see these records because you're not associated with the student through campus. There is larger conversations around least privilege approach to data access, and going that just because you're a teacher, you shouldn't see all of the students' academic records or all of the data on their profile. And that's probably more of some of the problems we'll start to address. In regards to probably permission escalation, it hasn't come up in a lot of conversations, but it's probably one for us to consider. But as I said, there's not as many times as that's come into play. But certainly as we look at the least privilege model, it's certainly something for us to consider.
Thank you.
Just a couple of comments on that. If you're wanting to do JIT, perhaps not so functional for pastoral, but for administrative purposes, you could leverage that through them having a separate account that they're like a separate Active Directory account they're granted access to for a temporary period, and then they log into Schoolbox for that for administrative reasons, much like a lot of IT teams do for their administrative access into systems. You don't use your normal account, you use a separate account to reduce the risk of if one gets compromised, then your admin access is compromised. One of our users just also noticed the impersonation log is showing linked account switches as well. So.
Well, then that makes it easy. So that solves the linked account piece, so you can see who switched to your marketing account. So that is, the impersonate log is actually showing you when you switch between your linked accounts. So when you change to being your admin account to market, the impersonate log is actually showing that. Correct, yep. So it is actually showing where that switch is taking place. One of the other things that came up, and I thought I added to my notes, so obviously didn't, is even if you have the impersonate permission, try and go and impersonate a super user and see what happens. And the second one is go and try and impersonate a pastoral moderator. Any moderator? I thought we only solved it for pastoral. Oh, we're a lot smarter than I thought. Oh, we're a lot smarter than I thought we were. So probably one of the questions is, are there purposes where you would need, like, I suppose it's if there's other roles or permissions. But yeah, I thought we only solved it for pastoral. That was the conversation I had with Newman the other day. I didn't realize we did it for all of them. So the question is, how many of you have got a list now of people you're going to go and delete as super users? Only a couple. That's not. I was expecting everyone to walk away with a few people they could delete. So I suppose my question is, what's the reason for your list of super users where you're not looking to reduce those permissions down for those that didn't put their hand up? What's missing? All right, over on the table. Well, that's valid. All right, someone not in implementation, down the front here.
Sorry, someone's been added as a super user. Can you see who has added that super user as a super user?
No, because that's why we trust our super users.
Okay. Well, there's a few new super users that have been added in the past day.
In the past day. Well, that's a conversation at school. But this is why it's important about, we don't want to go too restricted down the path of locking out absolutely everything. And, my experience is coming from a Moodle administration world where administering Moodle absolutely did my head in because the amount of permission structures and things like that. But we're trying to focus and the trust down a little bit more. But it is important those super users are the people and the key roles that you need to trust in the organization, so that when you go, who added these 5 super users, you've only got 3 people to point at.
Hi, we're new to Schoolbox, and we're trying to put in practice some processes that we had prior to putting it in. And one was enabling our school leaders the ability to post. So currently our school leaders can send emails. It's then caught and moderated before it's actually then sent out. So we've got the moderation tool for news, but we're finding it quite restrictive in the fact that it only works on your big groups, and then you can't target the moderator that looks after that. Is there anywhere on the roadmap that Schoolbox would look to moderators for pages and that students don't get the share with parents in the news dropdown?
So not a lot of people know of this story, which is how we got to news moderation. But even most of the people in the business are past this zone. We actually built that originally. So we built moderation so that every single group and class and workflow and campus could have different moderators and different structures. And then we tried to explain that to ourselves. And what we worked out is it was way too complicated to build the processes and the structures to implement it. And in a lot of our complex schools, it wasn't working. We did a lot of user testing and feedback with our schools, and it was just too complicated because the mechanisms that were driven behind it became really administrative heavy. And for a lot of our schools, they don't actually have large moderation teams. They don't have large numbers of people that are able to even handle, say for example, the sports page, you've got 15 posts a week. Even that was too big an influx for those people. So I know that it's back on the forums again. I'd recommend voting for it.
Yep.
But when we designed and built it the first time around, it was just way too complex to be able to implement.
The other thing is that when we turn moderation on, we're restricted from our staff from posting because of the fear that they'll post to parents. If I did turn the right on with moderation, it means that if they just want to post to staff, it then has to be moderated before it's sent out. Or if they want to post to a year group, it has to be moderated before it's sent out. So we're putting time constraints on people and allocating, maybe 5 moderators to have to consistently check to then release those posts out.
Yeah. Have a chat with, I don't know who your school engagement manager is, have a chat with them about the different ways you can design the solution around communication. Yes, there are constraints, but if we look at even some of our larger schools where you've got, 3,500 students and things like that, they've built mechanisms and processes in to be able to address it. So there are solutions to the problem. As I said, in regards to the increase in moderation, I'd recommend on the forums to vote for it. We invested lots and lots of time in designing, and it was just too complicated. Like it was a monster of a feature that when we went to our customers, it just wasn't going to work. Yep. It's probably a feature request to get us to add it in. But what we sort of, the assumption on permissions is that right permissions, you have the ability to communicate with everyone in that group. Your question is, should we consider parents to be a component of that group? That's probably a valid feature request, and if it's not up, I would add it.
So I've mainly been doing this in pastoral care stuff where we've started adding parents for notifiable things like drafts incomplete and stuff like that. But I'm starting to work on the news stuff where it actually prompts the user and informs them that it will go to a parent if they are to continue, and they get a yes/no option. If they hit no, it changes the selection back to a non-parent one. So you could possibly look at doing some JavaScript coding to, if they're only selecting like a primary and secondary campus, that it's most likely going to go to parents, and then it would prompt them to say, this is going to go to parents. Do you need to readdress your audience? But that's what I've been kind of working on for our school, is those kind of user experience pop-ups to guide staff into entering data correctly and targeting the right audiences and stuff like that. So if that interests you, it sounds like we need to get together anyway.
I suppose from my perspective is, do you want to shoot that code across to us so we can just drop it in the product? We're more than appreciative
at a
of
price.
saving our dev time there.
The skills just become a business.
But no, in all seriousness, where you've gone down the path of prototyping or developing a feature that sits like that, shooting it across at least going, hey, this is the journey, helps us understand if there's value behind it. One of our actual young developers worked at one of our schools and completely built, Zach. So Zach had actually built a whole bunch of stuff over the top of Schoolbox, and one of the reasons why we hired him is like, we want these 3 features in Schoolbox like within the first release of you starting. So if there are things that you think are valuable for everyone else, we're not like, we might actually build it ourselves, but at least being able to demonstrate and show, hey, this is something that we're finding valuable. We think other schools will. This is the approach I took behind it. Helps accelerate and solve that problem for others. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Yeah, so CMS. So CMS permission is, so it's actually prior to Schoolbox having, being Schoolbox as a learning management system and stuff. It's part of our old intranet days. So it gives you full permission to that entire folder structure. So I know someone was using it for groups. I don't know if that's your school or for like music groups and stuff like that.
So in a previous session, there was a lot of discussion about like what was best about Schoolbox for your school, and a lot of the conversations seemed to revolve around the fact that it was customizable and there were lots of things you could do, and it allowed people to make adjustments, and they brought in their own pieces. Is there kind of any plan for sort of some sort of extension store, or kind of like a way of sharing these things around?
Yeah, and I know that came up at the end there, the Q&A of James around the marketplace, and so what's really interesting, and I'm on this journey at the moment with a number of our integration partners as well, is how we validate the security and how we validate the code itself. With great power comes great responsibility. Even from a JavaScript perspective, we provide 2 different options for how that is used. One of those options, if you get it wrong, will take down Schoolbox and no one can access the instance. I will tell you now, probably 1 in 5 schools will do that. So it's sort of that, how do we do that in a safe manner? At the moment, we're working with our integration partners. So, large software devs to actually get them to align to not breaking things and meeting security practices and not using authentication from 2010. And as we move through that journey, then that might extend to other opportunities where it is community-led and other things like that. So I'm not going to say it's absolute no. It's a probably not yet situation.
If you go for a search on the Chrome store, you'll find plenty.
There's also a bunch on GitHub, so.
I wonder if there are any plans to pre-populating the blurb section in news when you send out news, because I don't know if anyone else has this problem. When I send out newsletters, I know I need to put a blurb, otherwise it just shows the first few lines of the story, but not everybody remembers, and I can't seem, and I don't have a way. At the moment, I'm asked not to moderate because I have a lot of other work. But Yeah. So is there any plans to give us the option to pre-populate it?
Not something I'm aware of, but I like probably a different conversation with maybe your account manager and stuff around what's there. One of the reasons why they were separated and isolated was the idea of grabbing the first section of the news item was that if you didn't go to the effort of adding the blurb, one thing if you do have access to it, and this is for everyone, the AI tool inside CK Editor, especially when writing news and calendar, is really, really helpful. So if you had access to the AI in Schoolbox, grabbing what you wrote as your core text, just going up the top, hitting the AI thing, and teaching your staff just to go, hey, summarize this, is a really helpful way of generating that content quickly.
Sorry, can I ask about the AI? I forgot about that. For the AI, how do we ensure that the information's used by that AI, or okay, let me change the question. The information used by the AI to answer students, how do we give AI questions and
Yeah.
answers to
So
it?
at the moment, we have no student-facing AI inside Schoolbox.
Oh, it's only for
Yeah. So as we and if we move down that path, and I'll use both of those terms, we'll build mechanisms in play to look at how we do it safely, what it looks like. But at the moment, they're not features that sit there. But I'm just mindful of time. We're going to focus and swing back around. So I'm hoping, if there are permissions or you think there are structures that are in play, either catch me at the end of this, we can have a chat about it, or make sure they get thrown up on help. As you can see, we're trying to continuously address everyone had access to everything. So if we are looking at the time and place permissions and things like that and looking at how we escalate, throw those things on help or have a chat and we can think about how we ideate and build mechanisms in play. But as I said before, there's also other areas where maybe there's a refresh or an idea. These are paths that we're going on. So when we look at pastoral care, one of these is the concept of match campus. So if you are using pastoral care and you haven't seen this permission or not aware of what it does, this becomes really, really important, especially in a school where you're primary and secondary. But even if you are running a middle and a senior campus. So what this does is it allows you to manage permissions dynamically on a record. So what that means is not all teachers need to see the pastoral records for all students. It's only those where they're in the same campus as the student. So this might mean that everyone within primary campus is able to see the students for the primary group. Or the other solution that sits behind this is if you have a heads of year group. Your heads of year group is everyone across year 7 to 12 or everyone from primary to 12. The users inside that group will only see the records for the students in that same campus as them. As they migrate from grade 6 to year 7, the permissions automatically update. Or if a teacher becomes new on that campus or moves away from that campus, the records are disappearing. So this becomes really, really important about focusing and narrowing down that focus of who should see those records. If you're using pastoral care and you're not using this yet, I'd recommend going and reviewing it, especially if you're a large K-12 school and you've got multiple campuses and multiple structures, and it applies behind those groups and those roles. It's a really, really good way of focusing those permissions. As I said, this applies to pastoral groups as well. So one of the things that we recommend is pastoral groups being more broad in structure. So what we mean by that is don't go and create a year 7 coordinators pastoral group, because in year 8, no one is able to then see those records. What we talk about is go and create your pastoral coordinators group or your year level coordinators group. Use the match campus to start to restrict down that visibility. Because one of the challenges if your permission structures get too tight is people can't see those records when the students are moving on. And often people think about the restriction of record in that particular year. The question is, how do we support it as they move through? These similar concepts around match campus, the aim is, and sort of the focus and the conversations we're having is, can we introduce ideas like this across other components of the system and other data in the system to make that more of a dynamic relationship rather than our old school belief that all teachers need access to it. So it's the start on that journey of a least privilege approach to the student data. So the last one, which I'll bring Evan up to run through, is a redesign of how we manage our student profiles and the permission structures tied into the profile information and the buttons associated.
Thank you, Dwayne. So you all might be familiar that we launched a brand new student profile editor earlier this year. So sort of to give some background on that, the student profile has always been one of the more contentious parts of Schoolbox between schools, what information we should and shouldn't show for which users. And we had many, many customers who we'd done custom work for on this page, where we actually had separate code for different schools. And this became a maintenance problem for us as well as the schools. So what we did is built a totally customizable profile and a profile editor. So what this effectively allows you to do is customize what fields are shown for each role that can view the profile. So you can choose, determine for each user type what fields are shown for every other user type. So what fields you want to show on a student profile for parents, staff, other students, and the student themselves can all be controlled separately on a per field basis. You can see in the top screenshot there's two tabs there, external fields and internal fields. External fields is the data that we can render on the profile that comes out of your SIS that you've connected to Schoolbox, and we read that out of the SIS just as the SIS has it. We do not do any processing on that. The internal fields, on the other hand, are the fields that are being read out of Schoolbox itself. So that could be data we've imported via the UPS from your SIS into Schoolbox, or it could be data that has been captured directly in Schoolbox. The other thing we wanted to bring to your attention is the ability for certain fields for you to have a privacy flag on them. So ones like the alerts, legal alerts, medical notes, and individual needs, and some others. You'll see it has that additional settings on the right side and the activate view more. And what that means is for students who might have data in those fields, instead of just showing the data on the profile, it will say that, hey, there's something here, we've hidden it for privacy, and you can, as the user, can click a button to reveal the field. And that gives them a chance to check that there might not be anyone around that shouldn't see that information over their shoulder, such as in the classroom. And just also on the left of the bottom screenshot, that shows you how you can set the visibility for each of those fields. You can also change the order of the fields as well, and a lot of the fields you can rename through our terminology system. Again, you might have been familiar with the profile buttons. So this is things that you could use, a lot of schools use to access things like IntelliSchools, timetables, summative reports, various other web links that you might want to have appended the student's ID on the back of before they're passed to that system. Previously, you had some control of that on Schoolbox, but not complete control. And you now have complete control of how those buttons are shown, the order they're shown in, and who they're shown to. Importantly, to just keep in mind, it's understand this concept of allow self. So that means that for a student, you might have, say, their button to go to their reports. You don't want that visible to other students, but you do want it to be visible to the student themselves. And that's what the allow self checkbox allows you to enable.
So,
and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I was going to say, while you're inside your admin area, go and look at that user profile configuration area. And go and look at the profile buttons and the user profile screen, because what you'll find now by adding those additional permissions in, you actually probably want to start restricting down more of that information. But also, if you do have a primary school, you might want to enable due work, but not enable the due work button. So you're starting now to look at a balance of different experiences and thinking about, well, I want to be using the functionality where we used to force, if you use the functionality, you get the button. You can now start to restrict that access down and start to restrict down. Or maybe it is only visible to teachers and not students. So while you're in there, are there any other questions around the permission structures and the pieces that are in play? I'll just bring my own mic over.
I've got two questions. The first one is there any move to doing it by permissions, particularly for pastoral? We find that people change the role and then 1 month later we find out, oh, someone's now a head of house and we haven't actually changed the person and they've missed out of a month's worth of pastorals.
And that's sort of why we use the pastoral groups. The group management in regards to how you add and remove people, the groups. This has been an interesting question that we've posed internally in regards to we don't know what to base it on. So we actually don't integrate with things like AD, where most people would be managing this, and most SISs don't provide consistent data in this space, so we don't have a valid and a good data source to be able to manage that. one of the things in the past is schools often would make the super user responsible for that user management. If you're looking at your pastoral moderators and training them up, they can now access that admin area and they can start to manage that a little bit more. If we can come up with a great idea on how we find out who those people are, we'll go and add it into one of those components for us. But yeah, we just haven't found out a good way yet.
The other thing you could look at doing is, I believe the user management system is available through our API. So if you are using a platform like Identity One to manage users, you could look at doing some automation through that if the fields are available in the API you need.
We need to add a new API endpoint for pastoral groups. That's probably the one that so I was going to say, is that on help? Because, and as you can see, every time I'm saying here, get that feature request on help, that's really, really important for us. Because as much as I even believe it's a good idea, my amount of sway is diminishing over time as we grow as a business. Your voice is more important than mine. So making sure that that's on help and getting voted up is really important. You had a second one?
Add impersonator, and then do I have to go like year 1?
All right, so what school are you from? Okay, cool. You need to have a conversation with your account manager in regards to your role structures. So the role structures you've got in there, we wouldn't probably recommend these days, or Claire, if she's still in the room, can have a chat with you. Cool. So the reason being is for that very thing. The number of roles you've got is probably something we'd look to reduce down. Yeah. Cool. I'll just walk. Not you.
Just a quick question with regards to permissions. Obviously, we're going to be assigning similar permission sets to groups of different people. So, like, let's say they're going to be news publishers. We're always going to select similar things for a news publisher. Is there any kind of setup for permissions groups coming in the future?
That would be a feature request on help again.
Yeah, but it's a good idea, and I hadn't actually thought of it. And it's probably tied to that same idea of how do we manage those groups of users so yeah, if it's not to help, get it up there, because it probably would make a lot of sense and make life easier.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you're using something like Identity One to map job titles to AD groups or intra-ID groups, then yes, if that's something it's technically possible, so please put it on help.
Yeah, and going back to something Evan said before, the user management API, you should be able to, I think you can update the roles, the service permissions on that.
You can definitely do groups.
Yeah.
We use pastoral care, so we assign permissions, and my understanding, I'm not an expert in that configuration, is that there's apparently a badge that comes up, like, depending on the categories. So we do have requirements where when we put sensitive categories, we don't want that to show up. Is there something in there that we do, because at the moment we're doing some UI magic to hide it?
So pastoral flags, which is what that is something that you control as a school. So when you look in the types and subtypes in the pastoral administration area, you choose the flag and color, and that then determines does it show on the student profile and on the class list. If you don't want it to show, don't apply a flag to it. Yeah, so it will be based on if they have access to that pastoral record. Like if they have access to a record, it will show. If they have access to no records of that type, it won't show. So yeah, that does all work. We can have another chat.
I think my question is to do with external and internal fields. Is there anything in the pipeline to, we're with ISAMs, but pull in custom fields, being able to display parents' information about passports, etc. Parents being able to update those and then feed back into our systems, because that's a massive thing that schools have to do on a yearly basis, follow up with parents.
Guess which school group you're from? So one of the challenges with custom fields is that they're custom fields. So trying to standardize approach for doing that becomes really, really difficult. There is sort of, for those of you that are not, or for those of you that are not synergetic, I'm going to explain our concept of how we do integrations now, but we actually have an abstraction layer that sits between the SIS and Schoolbox. It's a thing that we call the School User Data Store, or SUDS for short. And what that is we translate the external data into something that we know. The question is can we start to look at things like custom information landing inside that structure to then surface inside Schoolbox? Yes, the conversation has been had. Yes, the conversation has been had because there's a school group that keeps asking us. But it's a rather difficult problem for us to solve when we start to look at the scalability behind it. So it will be something that comes. It's just not something that we can do quickly.
Last question.
I want to ask about, you mentioned earlier APIs. Are there going to be some APIs? Do correct me if I'm wrong. I don't completely understand, except that it's the link to apps, right? But will there, or these platforms, but will there be APIs done automatically, and instead of us that won't require our approval? And if yes, will we be informed? Because the schools have a partnership with Schoolbox, but not necessarily the companies that. I mean, assuming that there are some that are automatically integrated, not with those companies.
No, we don't automatically integrate anything. So if you say subscribe to a Premier Partner, that integration has to be configured on a per school basis. They don't have access to Schoolbox instances by default. Absolutely not. With our API, when we add endpoints to our API, the user has access through the API only to what they would have access to through the user interface anyway, unless the super user creates a super user API key. Then obviously it has access to everything just like the super user does.
No.
No.
So nothing. So in regards to Schoolbox, we don't add systems or integrations into your product. It's your platform. You go through that configuration, and end users aren't able to add systems or integration pieces into the product either. It's all a super user function inside Schoolbox. But just mindful of time, and I'm guessing there's yummy food out there. Thank you very much. If you have any other questions, please come up and chat. But enjoy the food and enjoy this afternoon's session.
Thank you.